Welcome to Raaonline. I am Dr. Sudakshina. Today we are going to talk about the fourth ventricle in detail. It is always told that fourth ventricle is a very important question for your neuroanatomy, and it is not only an essay question, it will be also asked in your practical examination, and even as a short note question or a clinical based question also it can come in your exam. Coming to some of the clinical based questions which are related to fourth ventricle, and it can be asked in your university exams or international exams. The first question, as I put forward, an obstructive hydrocephalus can be caused by intraventricular bleeding in the fourth ventricle. Which are the structures which forms the posterior border of the fourth ventricle, and which is the structure which forms its anterior border? So basically this question is asking which is the location of the fourth ventricle, what are its boundaries. So what is the anterior boundary, what is the posterior boundary, so that we can say, in other words, which is the floor of the fourth ventricle and which is the roof of the fourth ventricle. Which structure forms the roof of the fourth ventricle, which has been asked already. In another way, we have asked the posterior border and the anterior border. Here directly we can ask which forms the floor of the fourth ventricle, or draw a neat diagram, label diagram of the floor of the fourth ventricle or the roof of the fourth ventricle, or both. So it can be asked as an essay question also. So let's go through the class, and then we can identify and we can tell at the end of the class that which are the floor structures and which are the structures which form the roof of the fourth ventricle, exactly where is the fourth ventricle located and how we get the floor and the roof of the fourth ventricle. So fourth ventricle, to introduce, it is a cavity of the hind brain. So as we start the ventricular system of the brain, the ventricles are actually going to contain the cerebrospinal fluid, and these are cavities within the brain which actually circulates and produces the CSF, and from one ventricle to another ventricle the CSF flows, and ultimately it flows into the subarachnoid space, and from where it is picked up into the venous circulation of the brain. So basically the fourth ventricle is the cavity of the hind brain. It is a tent-shaped space. It is definitely on the lower part of the pons and the upper part of the medulla oblongata, its location. Between the pons, medulla and the cerebellum. So as we know, the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum forms the hind brain. Dorsal to the pons and the upper part of the medulla, and it is ventral to the cerebellum. Let's see exactly where it is located through this video. So this is showing the brain. So you can see that the brain and the cerebellum is being shown over here, and you can observe here that we are showing the ventricular system in different colors. So you can observe here that this is the entire ventricular system. All the ventricles are being shown, not the entire system. So you can see the blue color is being shown as two lateral ventricles, which are the cavity of the forebrain or the cerebrum. Then we have the third ventricle in the center, which is the cavity of the diencephalon, or the thalamus and the hypothalamus is in its walls, and apart between the two thalami you are getting the third ventricle, which is the cavity of the diencephalon. Then the third ventricle is communicating with the fourth ventricle, which is shown in the green color, and this is through the aqueduct of Sylvius. And the fourth ventricle is the part which is lying between the pons and the medulla and the cerebellum behind. So it is dorsal to the pons and medulla and ventral to the cerebellum. Then it continues down as the central canal of the spinal cord. So this tent-shaped cavity, what we are seeing, which is the ventricle, which is the cavity of the hind brain. So as we know, the hind brain is mainly made up of medulla oblongata, pons and the cerebellum. This is called the fourth ventricle. So now we come back and show you the next slides. So you can see over here, This is the third ventricle, and then we have the fourth ventricle, the foramen of Monro. The collateral ventricles are seen, and you can also observe the foramen of Monro, which is communicating with the third ventricle.